On the evening of April 14th, 1982, Leningrad was cloaked in the familiar gray of post-industrial winter, lingering into spring. The city exhaled the steady hum of Soviet life, distant factory whistles, the low rumble of trams over cobblestone streets, and the muffled footsteps of citizens trudging home beneath the weight of state expectation. Smoke from communal heating stacks curled into the air, mingling with the sharp, metallic scent of the Neva River, creating an atmosphere at once oppressive and ordinary. On Bukarestskaya Street, among rows of uniform concrete apartment blocks built during Khrushchev's mass housing campaign, the Kazakov apartment stood as a modest two-bedroom unit. Its peeling paint and faint mold scent testified to decades of shared living and bureaucratic indifference. The walls were thin, privacy a concept barely understood by the ordinary Soviet family. Inside, Dmitry Kazakov, a bright and curious 7-year-old boy, played with a small wooden train. Its wheels clicked rhythmically against the floor, echoing through the apartment, competing with the distant sounds of the city. He paused occasionally, sensing the tension emanating from his parents' bedroom. Anatoly Kazakov, his father, was a mid-level engineer at a defense research facility, and Elena Kazakov, his mother, was a literature teacher. That evening, their whispers carried through the thin door. Dmitry did not understand all the words, but phrases like Yugoslavia, asylum, and escape prickled the edges of his consciousness. He froze in place, aware that something monumental was unfolding, something both dangerous and secretive. Imagine being a child forced to carry a secret so heavy it could determine the lives of your parents. For Dmitry, that secret would shape every moment of his young life and leave an indelible mark on his soul. The Soviet Union in 1982 was a society defined by stagnation. Economic growth had slowed, shortages of goods were routine, and the state's ideological control permeated every aspect of daily life. Citizens were measured not just by their labor, but by their loyalty, by the degree to which they internalized and demonstrated devotion to party ideals. Anatoly's workplace, a defense research facility, was under constant surveillance. Mid-level though his position was, the state viewed engineers as potential security risks as much as assets. Every action, every request for information, and even mundane personal habits were logged in security files maintained by his superiors and the facility's security department. The professional life of Elena was similarly constrained. Teaching literature to 5th and 6th graders required a careful dance. She had to encourage learning while ensuring that every story, every discussion, and every interpretation aligned with party doctrine. A misstep, a seemingly innocent comment, could be construed as ideological deviation. Outside the walls of institutions, life was equally monitored. Neighbors observed each other's behavior. The city itself was designed for efficiency and control. Wide avenues for surveillance, apartment blocks that encouraged visibility, and communal spaces where children and adults alike could be watched without suspicion. By May 1982, the Kazakovs had been approved for a family vacation to Bulgaria. To the state, it was a routine trip, an innocuous escape within the Eastern Bloc. But for the Kazakovs, it was the first step in a desperate plan to reach the West. Elena packed not just clothing but objects heavy with meaning. Photo albums chronicling generations, lace tablecloths reserved for family holidays, and Anatoly's grandfather's watch, carefully wrapped in soft cloth, went into suitcases. Each item represented permanence, lineage, and memory, a preparation not for a temporary trip, but for permanent absence. Anatoly meticulously reviewed maps and documents, running through the escape route in his mind. Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Austria. Every detail had to be perfect. Any mistake could doom the family. Dmitri, unaware of the full scope, sensed tension in every whispered conversation, every long silence at the dinner table, every sudden look exchanged between his parents. The air in the apartment carried a sense of anticipation, fear, and the almost tangible weight of a secret that could not be spoken aloud. Days before departure, Dmitri played in the courtyard with his best friend, Mikhail Petro. The courtyard was a shared space between identical apartment blocks, cracked concrete, struggling patches of grass, rusted swings, and a broken slide. It was a place of fleeting freedom, where children could momentarily escape the constraints of adult life. Dmitri's words spilled out almost accidentally. His family was leaving for the West, and they would not return. Mikhail, innocent and trusting, relayed the story to his father, Viktor Petro, a militia sergeant. In the Soviet system, information like this was treated as potential intelligence. Viktor knew the ramifications immediately and acted according to his duty. It was an unintentional betrayal, born of innocence. The words of a 7-year-old set in motion the surveillance, interrogation, and eventual destruction of the Kazakov family. Within a day, the report had reached the Leningrad KGB branch. Surveillance began immediately. Officers monitored the apartment, noted Anatoly's departures and arrivals, followed Elena to the school and the market, and even tapped their rarely used phone line. Every interaction, from casual greetings with neighbors to the smallest shopping trip, was documented. The KGB worked with patient precision, trained to detect deviations that ordinary citizens would never notice. They were not cruel for the sake of cruelty. They were instruments of a system designed to preempt dissent and neutralize potential threats. On May 20th, Anatoly met with Grigory Lidv at a small cafe by the Neva River. Lidv was a suspected facilitator of illegal defections, cautious and measured in every movement. Their conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, heads bent low, voices quiet. No documents changed hands, no gestures betrayed familiarity, but it was enough. The KGB officers observed, noted every detail, and used it to confirm the family's intention. The machinery of state control was relentless, moving swiftly to intercept a family before they could cross into Bulgaria. On May 21st, 2 black sedans arrived at Bukarestskaya Street. 6 plainclothes KGB officers entered the building and knocked firmly on the Kazakov door. Anatoly opened it, only to be told he was to accompany them for questioning. Elena appeared, demanding answers, her fear mounting as she saw the officers' stern expressions. Dmitri was separated from his parents, placed in a vehicle with strangers, and driven to a state children's facility. The boy's confusion and cries were met with cold efficiency. Neighbors later recounted seeing the black cars leave, the children's wails echoing against concrete walls. Life on the street continued as if nothing had happened. Anatoly and Elena were interrogated separately using psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, and isolation. Anatoly initially denied all allegations, insisting the Bulgaria trip was routine. By the 4th day, exhaustion and the weight of relentless questioning forced a confession. He admitted the plan to defect, detailing months of preparation, meetings with Lidv, and the hope for a free future for Dmitri. Elena corroborated the confession, explaining her participation as an act of maternal devotion. The human cost of their decision became starkly clear. Even the most carefully executed plan could not escape the omnipresent gaze of the state. Article 64 of the RSFSR Criminal Code defined treason as acts intentionally committed against the state. Defection by a defense worker fell squarely under this law. The Kazakovs faced a closed military tribunal. Evidence included surveillance reports, the cafe meeting, and confessions. There was no defense, no appeal, and the death sentence was carried out by firing squad on July 2nd, 1982. The state erased their existence. No obituaries, no public recognition, and no acknowledgement of their employment. To the world, the Kazakovs ceased to exist. Dmitry was placed in a state children's facility, later transferred multiple times. Klavdia Kazakova, his grandmother, petitioned for custody, but was denied as the state deemed children of convicted traitors in need of ideological supervision. Dmitry's childhood became a series of bland rooms, regulated schedules, and supervised visits. The psychological impact was profound. Attachments were dangerous, permanence was fleeting, and survival required emotional suppression. Even in these early chapters of his life, the consequences of totalitarianism were deeply etched into the psyche of a child, forced to navigate a world that had taken everything from him. Dmitry's days in the state children's facility began with the blare of a bell at 6:30 each morning. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, boiled porridge, and damp uniforms. Hallways were lined with institutional gray lockers, windows too high to offer a meaningful view, and walls plastered with ideological slogans. Serve the party with loyalty, and the motherland watches you. Each meal, every lesson, and every moment was regimented. Teachers and caretakers were tasked with not only educating but monitoring the children for signs of dissent or subversive thought. Dmitry learned quickly that curiosity was dangerous. Questions were tolerated only if they reinforced ideology. Emotional attachments were fleeting. Friendships were discouraged because they bred vulnerability. At night, lying in a thin bed, Dmitry replayed fragments of his parents' last moments in his mind. Their whispered words, the fear in Elena's eyes, the quiet strength in Anatoly's, became the only memories that anchored him. He began to write in secret, small notes hidden beneath mattress slats, letters to parents who could never receive them. Each word was an act of rebellion, a way to preserve humanity in an environment designed to strip it away. Klavdia Kazakova, a widow hardened by decades of Soviet hardships, refused to accept the state's authority over her grandson. She petitioned, argued, and begged at local government offices. Each rejection chipped away at her hope, but her determination never wavered. She remembered Dmitry as a boy who laughed freely, who ran barefoot across summer courtyards, and who asked endless questions about the world beyond the gray concrete blocks. That memory fueled her efforts. Even in small victories, like receiving letters or occasional supervised visits, Klavdia nurtured a fragile sense of agency against an impersonal, bureaucratic system that sought to erase her family's existence. The news of Anatoly and Elena's execution remained a secret for most of Dmitry's peers, though the staff spoke in hushed tones about children whose parents had betrayed the motherland. Rumors filled the gaps left by silence. Children speculated, and fear circulated like a virus. Dmitry, even at 8, understood more than most. The fear of his parents' absence mingled with shame imposed by a system that labeled him the child of traitors. He became hyper-aware of every word spoken, every glance from adults, and every whisper among other children. Each day was a psychological tightrope walk. School was a blend of rote memorization, political indoctrination, and subtle surveillance. Teachers evaluated more than academic performance. They assessed loyalty, conformity, and ideological alignment. Subjects such as history were rewritten to emphasize state triumphs, downplay tragedies, and glorify sacrifice for the party. Dmitri excelled academically, partly because knowledge was a shield, partly because the quiet curiosity instilled by his mother refused to die. Yet each accomplishment was tinged with guilt. Success was meaningless if it attracted attention that could expose hidden truths about his family. Dmitri's peers were cautious around him. Friendships required trust, and trust was dangerous. A single careless word could trigger whispers among staff or neighbors, potentially affecting survival. Mikhail Petro, once a close friend, became a reminder of the betrayal that had cost his parents' lives. Dmitri internalized lessons of caution, learning to smile without revealing thought, to laugh without attachment, and to navigate a world where every relationship carried risk. By the age of 13, Dmitri had begun to develop a more acute understanding of his circumstances. Adolescence in the facility was a constant negotiation between compliance and identity. Physical spaces reflected power dynamics. Dormitory walls were thin, leaving no room for secrets. Cafeterias smelled of boiled cabbage, and the echoes of guards' boots on linoleum floors were ever present. Every routine activity became a test. A misstep could be punished with isolation or reassignment. Dmitri learned to mask his grief, to hide his thoughts, and to present a compliant exterior, even as his inner world brimmed with unresolved sorrow and lingering anger. Despite pervasive control, Dmitri found ways to assert autonomy. A smuggled book hidden beneath bedding, quiet sketches of imagined landscapes, or whispered conversations with trusted peers became acts of rebellion. These small resistances offered fleeting freedom. They were reminders that even in the shadow of the state, the human spirit retained sparks of agency and creativity. As he grew older, Dmitri's desire to understand his parents' fate intensified. Archives, news bulletins, and scarce public records became avenues of exploration. Each discovery was layered with sorrow, each revelation a confrontation with the reality of the system that had claimed his family. Research required patience and secrecy. Dmitri navigated bureaucratic procedures, the obfuscation of state records, and the lingering threat of being perceived as subversive. Every new document carried weight, slowly reconstructing a past deliberately obscured. By his late teens, Dmitri emerged into a world still under Brezhnev's shadow. The economy remained stagnant, surveillance culture persisted, and the scars of childhood trauma shaped his identity. He became self-reliant, wary, and cautious. Trust was rare, intimacy almost impossible. Yet he carried fragments of hope, resilience passed down from his parents' courage, and a determination to reclaim his story and assert his own agency in a society that had denied him both family and freedom. Dmitri's journey from childhood to adulthood was inseparable from the legacy of totalitarianism. The execution of his parents, the loss of his autonomy, and the psychological imprint of surveillance created a lifelong struggle. Yet, his life also reflected the endurance of memory, love, and defiance. By documenting his parents' story, seeking out archives, and confronting systemic erasure, Dmitri transformed trauma into narrative. His life became a testament to the human cost of state oppression and the resilience of those who survive. Imagine living under a system that seeks to erase your family, your identity, and your very existence, and yet finding the strength to bear witness, to remember, and to reclaim a history that belongs to you. By the early 1990s, the Soviet Union was collapsing. Cities like Leningrad, soon to be renamed St. Petersburg, were chaotic mosaics of old imperial grandeur, gray Soviet apartment blocks, and streets lined with flickering neon signs for goods that were suddenly available after decades of scarcity. Dmitri was released from state supervision in October of 1992. The world outside felt foreign. The familiar routines of institutional life were gone, replaced by uncertainty, freedom, and disorientation. He was 18, legally an adult, yet emotionally still tethered to the years of surveillance, loss, and indoctrination that had shaped him. The city smelled of coal smoke, exhaust fumes, and damp brick. Construction scaffolding covered historic facades. Vendors sold imported clothing and goods previously unimaginable. It was a time of opportunity, but also of danger. A society in transition where law and order had weakened, and human connections were fragile. Dmitri's first goal was understanding his parents' fate. He navigated the labyrinthine bureaucracy of post-Soviet Russia, where archives were disorganized, records moved or lost, and former officials reluctant to speak. Every trip to a government office was an exercise in patience. Long lines, missing forms, and clerks unfamiliar with new transparency laws created frustration. Yet Dmitri persisted. Each small discovery, a date, a signature, a mention of his parents, brought clarity and renewed pain. Finally, in September 1993, after months of effort, a sympathetic archivist helped him access a fragment of the KGB file. Dmitri learned of the arrests in May 1982, the trial, and the executions in July of that year. He saw for the first time the chain of events triggered by the words of a 7-year-old boy and an 8-year-old informant. The reality hit him with devastating force. The decisions of adults, the mechanisms of the state, and his own childhood innocence had combined to destroy his family. Walking through the streets of St. Petersburg that autumn, Dmitri felt the weight of history pressing down. The grandeur of the Neva River, the spires of churches, and the crumbling facades of Soviet-era apartments all contrasted sharply with the personal tragedy he carried. He returned to his small communal apartment, sat at a rough wooden table, and wrote a note. It was a letter to the parents he had lost, a chronicle of grief, guilt, and anger. In those words, he tried to reconcile his own survival with the irrevocable loss he had endured. The note was a final act of communication, bridging the years and the silence imposed by the state. It captured the human cost of ideology, surveillance, and fear. Dmitri's life after gaining freedom was solitary. Work as a stock clerk offered survival, but no fulfillment. Relationships were fraught with mistrust. The psychological imprint of the Kazakov tragedy created barriers he could not overcome. Evenings were spent in quiet reflection. He revisited memories of his parents' home, the sounds of whispered conversations, the smells of Elena's cooking, and Anatoly's methodical work on blueprints and documents. These memories were both comforting and painful, reminders of a life stolen, but never forgotten. Every revelation about his parents' execution compounded Dmitri's feelings of responsibility. He understood that his innocent disclosure to Mikhail Petro had triggered the state machinery that ultimately destroyed his family. Guilt became a constant companion. Every noise, every unexpected knock, and every mention of authority reminded him of surveillance and betrayal. He carried the burden of the past like a physical weight, shaping decisions, relationships, and self-perception. Dmitri attempted to reconnect with remnants of his past. Letters to surviving relatives, visits to former caretakers, and inquiries into KGB records were part of a quest not just for truth, but for understanding. He learned of Klavdia Kazakova's declining health and the emotional toll of being denied custody of her grandson. He sought to console her, to share memories, but the years of separation and trauma created barriers even familial love could not entirely bridge. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought many lost stories to light. Journalists, historians, and archivists began uncovering individual tragedies. The Kazakov case emerged as a cautionary tale of surveillance, ideological control, and human fragility. Yet, for Dmitry, historical recognition offered no comfort. Facts and documents could not restore his parents, nor erase the psychological scars of a childhood spent under constant observation, guilt, and grief. The legacy of totalitarian surveillance extended beyond immediate victims. Dmitry observed its effects in society, people wary of expressing opinions, children taught caution, adults habituated to mistrust. The psychological imprint of authoritarianism was subtle but pervasive. Dmitry's life became a lens through which the enduring consequences of state oppression could be understood. By September of 1993, the weight of loss, guilt, and disconnection became unbearable. Dmitry's writing reflected despair, sorrow, and anger, a final attempt to narrate a life irreparably shaped by state control. In his small apartment, amidst gray walls and a modest wooden table, Dmitry took his own life. The note he left behind chronicled his understanding of the events, his perceived culpability, and his enduring grief. He was found the next morning by a landlord, the apartment silent, except for the faint echo of the life that had been lived and lost. The Kazakov story illustrates the destructive power of totalitarianism. It shows how systems designed for control and ideological conformity can devastate families, manipulate children, and leave lifelong psychological scars. Viktor Petro, Mikhail, KGB officers, and even sympathetic archivists all acted within the frameworks established by the state. Yet, the human cost remained immense. A 7-year-old child's words became part of a mechanism of destruction. A state designed to protect itself became a predator of innocence and familial bonds. The Kazakov's story is both historical and universal. It reflects how ordinary people, caught in systems beyond their control, can experience unimaginable tragedy. It reminds viewers of the value of freedom, the fragility of human life under oppression, and the enduring power of memory and narrative to preserve truth. Imagine being forced to live with a secret that could cost your parents their lives. Imagine growing up in a world that demands obedience at the expense of love and compassion. The Kazakov family endured this reality, and through their story, we glimpse the profound human cost of fear, control, and ideological rigidity. Take a moment to imagine walking through the streets of Leningrad in 1982, hearing whispers of fear, knowing that even your thoughts might be watched. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel. Consider sharing it, reflecting on the lives lost, and remembering the human stories behind history.